Hi, everyone. We thank you for joining us for today's Safety and Health webcast sponsored by Avetta. Just letting you know we'll be getting the presentation underway in about 1 minute as we allow everyone to file in. But again, we thank you for joining us. Hello again, everyone. Just as you file in, I want to let you know if you're looking for the webinar sponsored by Avetta, you're in the right place. Just allowing people to file in as we get the room up and going. We'll be getting things going in a little bit less than 30 seconds. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. MythBusters, is everything you know about OSH indicators wrong? Sponsored by Avetta. My name is Kevin Drewley. I'm an associate editor with Safety and Health Magazine, and we'll be moderating today's session. Thanks for joining us. We hope you all are safe and well. In a few minutes, we'll start a presentation, but first, let's review some preliminary items. The views of today's speakers and organizations are their own and may not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not necessarily mean the council or magazine endorses those items. At the end of today's webcast, we'll conduct a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and click the send button. Feel free to ask your question at any time during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the question and answer session to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but because of the large number of participants today, we might not get to every question. Any unanswered questions will be forwarded along to today's speaker. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey. I'll let you know more about that after the presentation. This webcast will be archived, so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, please visit safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. With that, let's go ahead and get started. Our speaker today is Pam Woloski. Pam is a CSP and a Senior Program Director for Specialty Technical Consultants Incorporated, with nearly 30 years of industry experience. Her work involves conducting management system assessments and developing risk management programs. Pam serves as an adjunct faculty member in the Indiana University of Pennsylvania Safety Sciences program and is a seasoned general session presenter at major OSH organizational conferences. Again, we thank you all for tuning into this presentation. Pam, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it. And thank you again to the folks at National Safety Council, Safety and Health Magazine, and to Avetta for jointly putting this webinar together. They're a great team to work with. I've done presentations with everyone before, and they make my job really easy, which is to get on here and spend an hour talking with you about a particular topic. Today is measuring occupational safety and health performance using metrics. And we are undergoing sort of a paradigm shift, or a seismic shift, if you will, in how we measure occupational safety and health performance in our organizations. So we're going to talk today a little bit about some of the problems with what we do now and why the things we're doing now aren't working, or maybe aren't valid or relevant. And then we're going to talk a lot about a new way of measuring performance through a new consensus standard that was published, an ANSI ASSP consensus standard that was published just in April of this past year. So I want to start the session off with a poll question, actually. And so I'm going to ask the poll question to go ahead and be launched. This will help me figure out how to kind of moderate or manipulate some of the conversation that we're going to have today. I'd like to hear a little bit about this. So I'm going to be quiet for a couple seconds while you figure out which of these answers you'd like to do. Give you another 3 or 4 seconds, and then we're going to go ahead and close the poll. We'll see how everybody voted. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's see what the results are. Great. Wow. So 31% of you know nothing at all, which is excellent, because we're going to really dig in at the fundamental level. A large chunk of you know a little bit, and most of you are in the those two categories. So excellent. You can go ahead and close the poll now. And we're going to move on to a discussion about performance measurement. So I'm going to start by talking about some myths. And these are myths that I believe to be true about how the occupational safety and health profession measures what we do in terms of our outcomes. And then we're going to talk about a way to sort of debunk those myths and move forward differently. So the first thing is that we measure the same terms, we use the same terms, and we measure the same things. And so we're very aligned in how we do that. And again, I would suggest to you that that's quite a myth. I did a research project, sort of an article review project for an article that I wrote for Professional Safety Journal a couple of years ago. And I ran into a lot of different terms that were being used. Metric and indicator is one example of some folks use metric, some folks use indicator. Some folks use lagging, some folks use leading, some use process, input, outcome. There's so many different terms out there that we use lots of different ones. But more importantly is that we really don't have a standardized definition. So if I were to say to all of you today, take one sentence to tell me what a leading indicator is. Give me a definition of a leading indicator. I'm sure there would not be consensus on that. The same for lagging indicator. So that's a problem for us as occupational safety and health professionals, because we're not speaking the same language with terms, and we're not speaking with the same definitions. And so that reduces our credibility. It leads to confusion. And as we move from one organization to another, there's a lot of upkeep that we have to do to try to figure out what we're doing in different places. This is the way that, if you ask Mr. Googles, this is the way the terms leading and lagging metrics or indicators are used in economics, excuse me. So a leading indicator is something that changes before the economy starts to change. The predictive value of a leading indicator varies, but they are used to indicate that something may be happening, something may be occurring. Lagging indicators are used to measure changes after the economy changes. And so, and I've underlined, they are not predictive. So you can't use a lagging indicator to predict what might happen in the future. However, in some cases, they can be very good at confirming trends or confirming outcomes or providing us with really good information. Way before the pandemic time started a number of years ago, there was a lot of talk about an inverse yield curve. And economists were talking about seeing the signs of a recession. And they were saying that they believed that to be true because the leading indicator of recessions tended to be inverse yield curves. Now, the pandemic happened, and of course, the recession that we're in now, or the pseudo recession we're in now, is a result of many other factors. But that's how an economist would use a leading indicator. The lagging indicator would be, did the recession actually occur? The second myth is this idea that while we all think that leading metrics are better than lagging metrics, that we all know what they are, that we can all do them, we can all develop them and participate in them. But that's not true. And I'm going to use some information from some Campbell Institute documents that were published starting in 2013, and that's where the data on this slide comes from. The Campbell Institute, which some of you know, is part of the National Safety Council, engaged a number of safety professionals in a journey on leading metrics. What are they? How to develop them? What are best practices? And the result of that was 5 really excellent white papers that are available to you if you're interested in reading them. And all you have to do is search for Campbell Institute, go to their website, and you can find those 5 white papers. This is from the first one, published in 2013. And in a survey of occupational safety and health professionals, on the left-hand side, you can see that they rated themselves as proficient or expert more than half of the time in terms of their understanding of what a leading metric was, how to develop it, how to use it, how to implement it. And then at the beginner or advanced beginner level, very low. Unfortunately, on the other side, they felt that their executives in their organizations were kind of the flip, right? So the vast majority of the people who participated in this survey believed that their executives did not understand what a leading metric was in terms of occupational safety and health. and how to implement it and how to use it. What that told me when I looked at it was that we were not aligned as professionals with our executives, our leadership teams, in terms of what we thought we should be doing. And that disconnect is also another part of the problem that I think we have with measuring occupational safety and health performance, because there's a disconnect between what we think it is and what our executives think it is. This is from that same publication, and this is the definition that they came up with, the professionals and some of the other staff that were working with them, to define a leading metric. And I've highlighted a couple of words on here because I think they're really important in terms of a potential definition. And you see the term preventative and predictive, things that monitor effective performance and processes of an EHS management system. So all those words are intended to indicate what a leading metric is and what it can do to help us. But again, here's the disconnect. In the same article, the people who participated in the study and some of the work of the Campbell Institute were asked to give a list of some of the leading metrics that they were tracking. And here's a list. Now, you may look at that list and say, what's wrong with that list? Well, my opinion is that there's nothing in that list that is predictive, that allows me to monitor, or gives me any indication of how activities may lead to a process or a program improvement. There's nothing wrong with tracking the number of near misses that get reported. There's nothing wrong with having a goal for the number of training hours that we want to accomplish in a particular quarter or in a particular year. But 5,000 hours of training only means that I had 5,000 butts in seats when training was going on. I have no idea if that training was effective and whether or not it did what it was supposed to do. I have no idea if those near misses were important, whether they led to some sort of an improvement within my organization. So while they may be important things to track and monitor, because they are important activities that are intended to prevent, they really don't tell us anything. And part of the problem is because they are isolated from the process. It's just a number that we're tracking. The third myth that we want to talk about is lagging metrics and how they have been used and continue to be used as a way to tell us how well our organization is performing. Lagging metrics, particularly incident rates, are often touted by many organizations, and probably yours, to say our program is safe, our organization, our workplace is safe because we don't have a lot of incidents. But we know that that's not true. We know that that's not true. There have been a number of studies and articles that have been published that take a look at these claims about particularly lagging incident rates. And what you see on this particular slide comes from an article that was published by Professional Safety Journal in April of 2021, so a little over a year ago. And it was called The Statistical Invalidity of TRIR. It is an excellent article, and I highly recommend that you obtain that article. If you're not a member of the American Society of Safety Professionals, you can probably obtain a PDF version of that article by asking, again, Mr. Googles for it. But what this group did that when they published this study was that they did a statistical analysis of incidents and incident rates for a number of different organizations. And what they came up with was the idea that incidents are actually random events that are often nothing more than the result of bad luck or timing. And if we're going to use an incident rate as a predictive indicator, we have to have millions of hours behind that rate before that rate is nothing more than random, statistical. There's no statistical validity in that rate. Oops, I'm sorry, went one slide too fast, sorry. The second problem with TRIR and other lagging indicators is that they count only what happens. So in other words, is what didn't happen a result of a program or a process improvement? We don't know. There's no way to know that based upon that isolated indicator, that isolated metric. And the last piece that they mentioned in this particular article is that severity is missing. right? So if I have 10 fatalities or 10 minor injuries that are recordable, I'm going to have the same TRIR. So when I'm comparing my TRIR to someone else's TRIR, that doesn't really help me because I have no idea what's in the TRIR of the other organizations that I'm basing my requirements on. And if I'm using a TRIR to compare last year to this year, unless I have millions of hours and hundreds of months, there's no statistical validity between those two data points. The fourth myth is that if I add an incentive to a metric, it'll help me achieve it, and therefore it improves that metric and allows me then to benchmark against my organization's occupational safety and health program. There's a lot of reasons why this is a problem, and certainly many of us are familiar with what happened a number of years ago when OSHA started to take a look at incentive programs and discovered how often they increased the underreporting of true incidents. So Peter Drucker, of course, said what is measured gets managed. And that's important because when we put attention to something by measuring it, we put attention to it by activities that surround it. But what we know in occupational safety and health is what gets measured gets done. If I ask for 10 near-miss reports per business unit per week, and I give some sort of a reward for that, I'm going to get 10. In fact, I'm probably going to get 11 or 12 just to be on the safe side. Doesn't matter whether they're any good in terms of quality, I'm going to get that number. And as we just said, those numbers can be manipulated by people who don't report a particular incident because they want to make sure that the incentive and the reward occurs. Anybody has to just remember what happened to Wells Fargo in order to, oops, I'm sorry, I did that again, my bad, apologize. Everybody just to remember what happened to Wells Fargo a number of years ago. And this information is from an article that comes from the Harvard Business Review in September of 19. And the CEO at the time of Wells Fargo, John Stumpf, created a metric called 8 is great. The idea was sound. If we want to provide value to our customers, the more products that we get our customers to use, the deeper the relationship, the better the value. That makes a lot of sense, right? And so the more products, the better the relationship to the customer. However, by establishing a metric and placing that metric with rewards on the customer service employees, it led to the requirement or the expectation that we're all going to get 8 products for each customer. So in other words, if you wanted a credit card from Wells Fargo, you might find yourself signed up for a home equity line of credit or a business loan or some other product that you never asked for. And in fact, some of the customer service representatives signed you up without your permission. When it all fell down, the CEO became the ex-CEO. There were tons and tons of penalties associated because some of the activities were illegal. They created a huge problem with the reputation of Wells Fargo that to this day is still an issue. The problem, of course, is that the metric was not aligned properly to the strategy. The people who were implementing the metric weren't consulted. They were just told what to do. And so their focus became meeting the metric at all costs. And I'm going to bet that of the nearly 200 people that are on this call right now, on this webinar right now, I'm going to bet at least 2/3 of you have had this experience somewhere in your career. So now what, right? We've got all these problems associated with how we measure occupational safety and health performance. The things that we've been doing either aren't working, we're using metrics in ways that they aren't intended to be, and they tend to be isolated not only from business operations, but also from each other. And so if we open up our dashboard, we see all these lovely colors and numbers that are completely isolated. We track one metric here and we track one metric there and one metric here. But they're not conjoined together in some sort of a process. They're not associated with an improvement within our organization. But we now have a solution. we have a new standard that has been published, as I mentioned at the beginning, and it's called ANSI ASSP Z16, technically Z16.1-2022. That's the formal name for this particular standard. And it was published in April by ANSI and the American Society of Safety Professionals. Remember that this is a standard, not an OSHA regulation. And because it's a standard, it follows, it's an ANSI standard, it follows the consensus standard process. And if you're not familiar with that process, just a real quick explanation. A group of people that represent all of the stakeholders associated with a particular topic or a particular issue are brought together and form a committee during which they write the standard. And in order for the standard to be approved and then published, there has to be a consensus. So all of the stakeholders have a say in what happens and what's in that standard. Now, everybody doesn't have to agree to approve it. There are certain rules about the number of people, but the process really works to attempt to obtain a consensus among all the stakeholders. Now, OSHA certainly, when they develop a standard, they reach out and they ask for information, and they take that information, and I have no doubt that they give it serious consideration. But at the end of the day, OSHA writes the standard, and OSHA publishes the standard and determines what's going to go in it. One of the things that I believe makes this particular standard a game changer, and I use that term deliberately, is that it has clear definitions. Remember, what's a leading indicator? What's a lagging indicator? Should we use metric? Should we use indicator? There are definitions in the standard that we can use when somebody asks us what a leading indicator is. And it has a process, an iterative process that we can use over and over and over again. Also important is that it addresses the impact of our programs and our processes. So in other words, we're not just looking at a leading indicator like the number of training hours that are accomplished, or a lagging indicator like how many injuries occur or how many near misses occur. We're looking at a linear approach to performance measurement that marries leading and lagging indicators or metrics in this particular standard together, and focuses their review and their development on a program or a process. This allows us to demonstrate value to the business. Organizations invest money in their occupational safety and health programs, and they want to know that they're getting a value for that investment. The last thing about this particular standard is that it uses a balanced approach. Some of you may have heard the term balanced scorecard, and this is very similar to that. It's a balanced approach that takes into account improvement or risk reduction of our organization's most serious risks, our SIPs, serious injuries and fatalities, or FSIs, fatalities and serious injuries, whichever acronym you've chosen to use, as well as the improvement of our management system. And we balance risk reduction and management system together instead of in an isolated process. This particular standard, again, it was published in 2022 in April. The original committee that developed this standard is very old. Had been around for a really long time, and developed 5 different standards on performance measurement, way back in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, all the way up through the 90s. Once OSHA and BLS took over record-keeping activity, those standards were withdrawn. And what happened, of course, was that we then began to use OSHA record-keeping as our way of measuring performance improvement. The current Z16 committee was reestablished in 2017 with the intent to revise one of the withdrawn versions. However, once they started digging into the current thinking about measuring occupational safety and health performance, they ended up deciding to rewrite the entire standard and completely upending the way we think about occupational safety and health measurement. And so that's why it went from 2017 to 2022 for the standard to be published. This is a picture of the standard, which is available for purchase from the American Society of Safety Professionals. Of course, because it is a consensus standard, it is not available to you for free. You do need to purchase it. And this is the table of contents. We don't have time today to go through every single one of those individual sections. We're going to focus on section 2, 3, and 4 in our comments today, and we'll mention a little bit about what's in some of the other appendices at the very end. So let's start right off with the definitions, because I think that's really the critical piece. It gives me as an occupational safety and health professional a way to validate a definition of a particular indicator. So a metric is a quantifiable measure that tracks and assesses the status of a specific process. And I've underlined process there, and I'm going to reinforce that concept as we continue to talk about both these definitions and then how this process of developing metrics works. These are the definitions of lagging and leading metrics. So the lagging metrics are the consequences of actions that we've taken, programs or process improvement, or not taken. And they're usually the results at the end of a particular time period. Lagging metrics answer the question, what are we trying to achieve? Leading metrics are capable of influencing or predicting or preventing future events. And remember the definition that we looked at a little earlier from the Campbell Institute on the definition of a leading metric. This is right up that alley in terms of what that metric was talking about. So a leading metric answers the question, what are the inputs that will help us achieve what we want to achieve in this particular program? A critical thing to remember is that individual leading and lagging indicators are no longer considered to be adequate in terms of measuring performance improvement. They must be paired together in a linear approach, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. The last and really critical definition that is in the particular standard is something called an impact metric. And this is a brand new term, hadn't been used before. It's not really out there in the literature anywhere. But an impact metric is one that reflects the organizational impact of programs and policies and procedures, right? That's the thing that helps us demonstrate value to the organization for their investment in occupational safety and health programs. Because it isn't just about, and it is about, but not just about reducing incidents. It is also about impacting the organization, impacting its bottom line financially, improving its productivity and its quality and its employee morale. All of those are impact metrics that this particular standard encourages us to begin to identify and track. This is a model. This is in Appendix A1 of the standard, and I use this particular graphic with permission of ASSP. And this is the model that talks about how those metrics, leading, lagging, and impact, look when we put them in place. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular one because I want to dig into how it works and how we implement it. But notice the linear process going on here. Leading metrics, lagging metrics, impact metrics. Input, activities, output are the leading metrics, and lagging metrics and impact metrics are the results, the things that we see after the program or process was improved. This is the graphic of the balanced approach that I was talking about before. The approach that's used in this standard is systematic and it's replicable, and it's intended to balance or show some intervention between risk reduction, our serious injury and fatality or other high risks, and our management system improvement. And between those two is that balanced approach that we're looking at. So this is, again, a graphic from the standard used with permission. And I'm going to show you how it works or explain how it works, but you can see the balance set. So down the left-hand side is how we identify risk management metrics. And on the right-hand side is how we identify safety and health management system improvement metrics. So let's take them one by one and we'll kind of walk through each of the individual blocks that you see on the slide right now. Let's pull some of them out and dig in a little bit. So as an organization, if I'm looking to develop a risk management metric, I'm going to look for candidates for risk reduction. I'm going to look at my risk assessments, the things that have the greatest potential for loss, the things that have the highest severity or likelihood. I'm going to look at my loss analyses, inspections, incidents, workers' comp information. I'm going to look at how my hazards and controls are being implemented and evaluated. Do I have lots of nonconformities? Am I using too many low-level controls? All of these help the organization identify those risk management metrics. And once I've come up with that list, whatever that list is and however many is in that list, then I have to prioritize them. Where can I get the greatest improvement potential by putting some time and attention and a program or process improvement into it? So I look at the resources and the technologies that might be required to reduce the risk of a particular issue, the funding that might be needed, the people, capital expenditures. And I think about the hierarchy of risk treatment, right? The hierarchy which tells us avoiding, eliminating, simplifying, engineering, work, administrative controls, and then personal protective equipment. Once I've identified a particular area that I want to begin to work on, I now need to select what's called an element or an attribute that I want to measure. So elements are that part of risk management, the key pieces of risk management. And I've given you some examples there: risk identification, risk assessment, risk monitoring, risk consultation, et cetera. Those are the elements of risk management, the pieces. Once I've identified an element, I want to identify a key characteristic of that element. So in other words, what is a particular characteristic of risk identification or risk consultation? In the standard is a table that gives you plenty of really good examples. You can use them right out of the standard or make up your own. So two that I've given you here on the slide. For risk identification is the element. The attributes are identifying all the aspects of a risk, like the actual hazard, as well as the trigger events and the other kinds of failure modes that might occur that would expose a worker to the hazard. For risk treatment element, the attributes might be the design or the redesign of the workplace, which is a higher level risk treatment. So once I've got that element and that attribute that I want to measure, now I have to develop my metric. I need to select my leading, lagging, and impact metrics. And here we start from the back end. We start at the end of the process and ask ourselves, what do we want to achieve with this program or process improvement? Those are our lagging metrics. Then we ask ourselves, how can we influence that result? What can we do, outcomes, to influence those outcomes, processes, activities, etc. Oh, ouch, excuse me, I just banged my knee. Those are our leading metrics. And then the last thing we consider, what impact will all of this have on organizational strategy? And that becomes our impact metric. On the others, and we're going to show an example in just a few minutes. So let me work through the process first, and then we'll show an example. So now I'm going to go down the second side of my balance set, and I'm going to look for opportunities to improve my occupational safety and health management system. Now, it's important when you're implementing this process that you identify the risk management metrics and processes first, because the way this works is that the risks that you're trying to reduce should be aligned to some part of your occupational safety and health management system. So they should be aligned. They're not separate. We're not talking about risk management metrics, and then over here we're going to have safety and health management system metrics. They're supposed to be balanced and aligned together. So here's how that looks. The first thing that we want to do is typically we need to do some sort of a gap analysis of our management system, right? We need to figure out where our management system is succeeding and where there are problems. And again, as I just said, we're looking for alignment with the risk metrics so that they complement each other. And we're going to compare the gaps in our management system to our organization's strategic objectives, or we can even benchmark against an industry. One word about a management system for a minute before we move on. You may or may not have a formal ISO 45001 certified management system, or you may or may not have an ANSI ASSP Z10 management system. And when I say that, I mean a capital M and a capital S, because those are specific management system criteria and standards. But every organization has a management system, small m, small s. Right? Every organization has programs, processes, procedures, the way you do things. And so when you're looking for management system metrics, if you don't have a formal ISO 45001 or Z10 management system, you're still going to be looking at the way in which your organization functions. So once we've done that gap analysis, we're going to go back to the process of selecting elements and attributes to be measured. So the elements of any management system, MS, capital MS, small ms, leadership, support, monitoring, continual improvement. And then there are tables that you would use to develop those, or you could create your own. So I've identified two here. The element of leadership, an important management system attribute of leadership is that top management has a commitment to allocate sufficient resources to make the management system work. In support, the element of support, there are processes in place to improve the competency of workers. Any management system has to make sure that the people who are doing the work are competent to do the work. And that includes all kinds of things like training, which is a traditional way in which we try to improve competency. But there are other ways in which we do that. Skill development, licenses, certificate programs, our hiring practices. So if we identify that a person in this particular role must have these particular skills to be competent, we need to make sure that we either hire them with those skills or find a way to develop them in the process. That's our management systems way of making sure that workers are competent. And then we're back to the same questions that we asked before. If we want to figure out what our lagging metrics are, we ask, what do we want to achieve? Then we ask, how can we influence that result? And last, what impact on the organizational strategy will occur as a result of what we do? So there's both sides of it. Let's move on to another poll question. And I have a specific reason for asking this. So if we could please launch poll question number 2. So this is a little easier. The answers are pretty simple. So I'm going to give you another 5 seconds to finish answering this particular question. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, go ahead and close the poll and bring up the results. Okay, so for the most part, you all feel like you're in pretty good shape with understanding the important risks in your organization. That's really important. 64% of you think you're in good shape, because on the left-hand side of this process, you can go ahead and close those results now. On the left-hand side of this process, it's important that we understand what our most important risks are, because that's where we're starting with our process. So here's how this will work. I'm going to work my way down the left-hand side of the graphic first. A significant risk identification that I have come up with in my organization is falls from ladders. That is a significant risk. That particular work tasks that require people to work from ladders creates a significant risk. And I know that because I've looked at risk assessments and workers' comp loss runs, and I know that I've had a lot of incidents associated with that. I've had a lot of serious injuries. I've not had any fatalities, but the risk assessments that I've done indicate there's a pretty high probability. The ladders I have are old. They're not in good condition. So I may not be purchasing them, replacing them in the way that I need to be. And there's a lot of work at heights tasks. So how can I now take that risk and think about how I want to reduce it? A couple of ideas would be to minimize the use of portable ladders, right? So we may still be working at heights from a mobile platform or a lift, but it's a whole lot less risky of a way of doing work at heights tasks than it is to be working on a portable ladder. On the other hand, I could begin to redesign some of my work tasks so that I have less work at heights. This is how I can reduce this risk. And note, I'm not talking about better training or more inspections. Those are low-level controls, which aren't going to give me significant risk reduction. Remember our hierarchy of risk treatment. So now I'm going to pick metrics. What am I trying to accomplish? Well, one of the things I might want to try to accomplish is to reduce the number of work tasks that require portable ladders. The less work at portable ladders, that would helpfully reduce the risk. If I had an inventory of portable ladders that went down and the inventory of mobile lifts and platforms that went up, those would be good metrics that would tell me that I'm being successful in reducing the number of tasks on portable ladders and redesigning those. So in order to influence those lagging metrics, what do I need to do? I've given you a couple of examples. So this organization has risk assessments for all their work tasks, but unfortunately, there are tons of them that were written years ago. And there are tons of them that were written with lower level controls as a way to protect the worker, training, work practices, PPE. So maybe I want to evaluate the number of work tasks where I revise the risk assessments, particularly the work at height tasks. And maybe I want to take a look at the number of risk assessments that recommend higher level controls rather than lower level controls. These activities ought to lead to some lagging metrics in terms of the outputs of my program and process improvement. Let's take a look, and we'll get to the impact in just a second, but let's look at the management system and how this ties into the management system. So I've done a gap analysis, and I know that my top leadership, top management, doesn't allocate enough resources to revise the risk assessments. I know that. I say that I'm going to do risk assessments once a year or other triggers, but we don't have enough resources to do that. And I know that I don't have enough workers engaged in both task design and risk assessments. Those are the gaps in my system, leadership and implementation. Those are the elements and the attributes. So how might I address that in terms of metrics? So a lagging metric that might tell me if I was being successful in improving both of those would be that I would see a resource allocation for equipment purchases. In this case, mobile ladders or lifts. I might also see an increase in the number of risk assessment teams, because the more teams, the more risk assessments. The more risk assessments get done on the frequency that I need to get them done. So the percentage of work tasks at heights, those particular risk assessments get revised. How might I make that happen? So here's where we're looking at systems improvements, right? In this particular organization, occupational safety and health managers have very limited purchasing authority. So the allocation of resources is very hard to access by the people who need to access them. So as a leading metric, we're going to change our equipment authorization process, and we're going to give our occupational safety and health managers more approval process. We're going to set a dollar amount that allows them to make those decisions and make those purchases. Now, we're not going to give them a credit card or a blank check. We're still going to have some controls on the purchases, but we're going to open it up a little bit. We're also going to improve the occupational safety and health department for training risk assessments so that we can develop more risk assessment teams, which will then lead to some of those lagging metrics that we're looking at. Now, once we implement all of these things on both sides of our balanced approach, what might we see in terms of the impact to the organization? So in risk reduction, we might expect to see a decrease in our workers' comp premium. If we have less people falling off ladders, less injuries associated with working at ladders, we might expect to see that premium go down. That would be an important financial impact to the organization. Decreasing the work at height tasks would be an important overall decrease in the risk profile of the organization. From a management system improvement, once we realized as an organization that resource allocation barriers existed for purchasing mobile platforms and lifts, we found that there were other areas where there were resource allocation barriers, not necessarily occupational safety and health, but we identified those barriers and we corrected them. And as a management system improvement, our worker engagement survey results would improve. Workers are feeling more important to the process, engaged in the process. And so the survey that we take every year or every other year shows that workers are feeling better about how they're being involved in the process. So that's a management system improvement as a result of this risk reduction. That's how it works. It's really cool. It's all tied together, and it impacts the organization from a strategic perspective, not just reducing the risk profile, but also improving the management system of the organization. I want to say a few more words about a couple of other pieces in the standard before we open it up for some questions. So give me just about 5 more minutes. In this standard, there are a number of appendices. Appendix A, and frankly, let me just say that the appendices A, B, C, and D are worth the price of the standard for the information and examples that they give you. So Appendix A explores each of those sections in greater detail, and it has 3 very extensive tables. A1, A2, and A3. And they are sample metrics, both risk management, safety and health management system, and balance set together. So you can see how the two work together. Now you can go right in there and use exactly what's in there, or you can use that to kind of launch a brainstorming session within your organization about how that might work. Appendices B, C, and D. B has pages and pages of examples of lagging metrics. C, pages and pages of leading, and D, pages and pages of impact. Again, these appendices are worth the price of the standard in terms of the ways that it helps you understand how to do this. You can read the standard with the sort of heavy, higher level language, but the appendices really, really help you take off the process. So I've got one more poll question that I want to ask you before we get ready to close up our time together. So let's go ahead and launch that poll. I'll give you a minute to read it. So answer this as honestly as you possibly can. Nobody will know what you say. So if it's complicated, go ahead and answer it that way. Give you 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's see what we got. Awesome. I like that. You have some legwork to do. We're going to talk about that in the next and the last slide. You need to go back and process that information. Absolutely. You need to do that. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of legwork that needs to be done. I'm glad to see almost 20% of you are ready and are ready to go ahead and get started. We'll talk about what to do. And for those of you who say it's complicated, I hear you. I get it. We have been telling, you can close the results now. We've been telling our organizations for 40 years how we measure occupational safety and health performance. And we have said that a low TRIR means we're safe, right? We've said these things. And so it's not as simple as just switching and moving on to something new. We run the risk of saying to our organizations, here's the flavor of the month. We're not going to do it this way anymore. We're going to do it this way. And that's not going to get us anywhere. So you really have to give some thought to how you might implement this standard. Don't go running into it until you're sure. So here's my suggestions on what you can do now to get started. Oh, come on, get that last slide to come up. There it is. The first thing you have to do is buy the standard, right? I promise you, I get nothing as a result of your purchase of the standard. And if you're an ASSP member, the fee is a little bit lower than if you're not an ASSP member, but still a tremendous value. And then you can't do this by yourself. You really can't do this by yourself. You need to gather a transition team. And you want to make sure that all levels and business units of your organization are represented in that team. And I'm not talking about 15 or 20 people. I'm talking about 6 to 8, maybe 10 really well-selected people who can help with the transition. And then you have to come up with a transition plan. After you read the standard and understand it, make sure everybody's on board, you have to plan for your transition. So you're going to have to think about how are you going to introduce all of these concepts into your organization, because they're so different than what you've been saying for a really long time. And so I'm advocating something that I call a bait and switch approach, right? You're not going to be successful if you go to your leadership and say, never mind, we're not going to measure TRIRs and lagging rates anymore. And we're not going to do those training hour and keep track of how many near miss reports we get. We're just not going to do that anymore. We're going to do this now, right? Your organization, your leadership is going to say, yeah, okay. So leave in place what you have in place. Don't stop doing what you're doing. But as you begin to transition into a newer way of doing things, it's important that you begin to socialize that and perhaps reduce the amount of attention you're paying to some of the older way of doing things. And I should mention, there's no way you're going to stop tracking lagging incident rates because you have to do it for record keeping purposes, but don't give it so much attention. And then you need to develop a consensus on your top 5 risks. And that was why I asked that question earlier. You need to have an understanding of what those top 5 risks are, because that's where you're going to get your significant risk reduction metrics. And you need to conduct a management system gap analysis so you know where those problem areas are. And that's really your first steps before you begin to implement it. Once you have those processes done, then your next step is to just simply ask yourself, what are we trying to improve? What area are we thinking, what program, what process is not working the way it should be and needs to be revised and tweaked and changed? Or is there a new program or a process that we're getting ready to implement? Is there a new process line that we're going to be implementing in our organization, a new product that we're going to be retooling our process areas to do? What are we trying to implement? Those are the baby steps. Pick one, just pick one, and work your way through that process that we went through, down the left-hand side of the risk management, and then down the right-hand side of the management system improvement, and put them all together, and then launch it. Launch it as a pilot, maybe one particular part of your organization, and give it a try. This is a paradigm shift. This is a huge shift and change for what we've been doing to something completely different. And it's going to take time. So give yourselves that time and allow yourself the opportunity to do that. So are you ready to get started? I hope so. I hope that I've given you some new ways of thinking about things, and I've gotten you excited about the standard and how it might begin to be able to help you. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I see in the Q&A, I don't have it open, but I see that there are some questions. So I'm going to ask my friend Kevin to kind of throw those questions out there and let's talk. And please feel free to share experiences and anecdotes in addition to questions. So take it away, Kevin.
All right. Thank you, Pam, and excellent as always. Great job. We thank you for sharing your insights and expertise. Before we do dive into the Q&A, just want to let everyone know about the evaluation survey that we're asking you to complete. That survey will open in a different screen after this webinar. We really appreciate your input as it helps us to improve our future webcasts. As Pam said, we're getting some questions trickling in, but once more, a reminder, if you want to ask a question, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and then click the send button to submit. And with that, we will get to some of those questions. First one, kind of looking for a clarification, Pam says, so it appears that you're suggesting we have a new trio of leading, lagging, and impact versus the old duo of leading and lagging metrics, right?
Yes, and what I would say is that the way most organizations use their metrics is that their lagging and their leading metrics are isolated from each other. So you may have 5 or 6 leading metrics that you're tracking and 5 or 6 lagging metrics that you're tracking, but they're not connected. And if you remember that model, that linear model that we looked at, that's really the importance of this approach. We're not isolating those indicators anymore, those metrics anymore. Leading leads to lagging. Those two have to be paired together rather than isolated. That's a really critical part of the process because that's what ties it to a specific process, a program initiation or implementation or improvement. And that's really, really critical.
Next one, kind of on a similar vein, says, it seems to me that when looking to create impact metrics, we're using higher level controls that cost money, meaning that I'll have to educate prior to the next budget cycle before I can make a change in our metrics. Am I on the right track?
Yes and no. So one of the things that the standard allows you is that not every balanced approach of risk reduction and management system improvement requires an impact metric. Ideally, you'll be able to identify one, but it doesn't require resources. For example, one of the impact metrics might be associated with employee morale. And the example that I shared with you showed how worker perception survey results were improved because workers felt more engaged in the process. They felt they were better able to help with the design and the redesign of tasks and the participation on the risk assessment teams and the activities. And so that worker morale, that impact might improve. But yes, some of the impact metrics are associated with expenditures of finances, resources that may require some time. But depending upon when your budget cycle is, right? It's July. If you're on a calendar budget, your budget cycle might be started already. There's a lot of legwork that needs to be done to read the standard, gather your team, and begin to talk about a transition plan, get those top 5 risks identified, do a management system gap analysis before you have to start asking for money if that's what you think you're going to need. So start the legwork now. Don't necessarily wait until it's time to start asking for money.
Next question says, it seems to me that a balanced approach to measures is actually a risk tool and therefore should be listed as a risk reduction tool in the risk standard. Could you comment on that, please?
So the risk management standard, there's an ISO and an ANSI risk management standard, which is 31,000 and 31,010 are the different techniques that are used. Part of risk management is monitoring, right? Risk treatment and monitoring and evaluating the impact of your risk assessments and the approach that you're taking to treating those risks. And so to that extent, yes, they are integrated. The same is true with a management system standard, right? ISO 45001 and Z10 both require you as part of your implementation to first identify your outcomes, what you expect the management system to do, and then say whether it's happening or not. That management review that's required to be completed by top management is really looking at whether or not those things are happening. And both of those standards have, in addition to the risk management standard, both of those standards have sections or clauses on performance measurement. And so that fits so nicely, Z16 fits so nicely into both of those.
Next questioner says he realizes that many organizations are different, but might there be 6 or 8 or just a handful of basic metrics that you think an organization could start with?
Yes, and at the risk of listing what they might be, that's where the value of the standard is in terms of those particular tables. And that's where you can see how an individual risk reduction approach of a particular area, what potential lagging and leading metrics might be, and the same with management systems. So it's complicated. There's a lot of options, a lot of opportunities. So what I would encourage you to do is to not think there's a list out there somewhere that I can follow, because that takes you away from the process. That starts you out with, this is what I'm going to measure, rather than what are our significant risks and what do we have to do to reduce them? And where are the gaps in our management system and what do we have to do to improve those? And once you answer those questions, then you can begin to identify what the potential metrics are for those particular parts of your balanced approach. So don't start with a metric that says this is what we're going to figure out. Don't work your way backwards. Start with your risk reduction and your management system improvement.
Will OSHA ever move away from TRIR, and how does OSHA view a TRIR rate on companies that have less than 100 employees, since the number can be skewed compared to companies that have over 100 employees?
Yeah, I hear you. I'm with you there. Will OSHA ever move away from the TRIR rate? I do not think so. But one of the things that's really important that I've learned in the past couple of years as I've done more investigating in performance measurement is that the record-keeping part of the OSHA regulations was never intended to be a way to measure performance. It was always a way that OSHA established to direct resources and to identify what was happening. And I would not throw TRIR out with the bathwater. There are lots of good reasons to continue to track and take a look at what kinds of incidents that you're having. I don't think that the rate as an aggregate number is very valuable to us. It's what's in that rate, which is where we get to find and identify problems. So if you're looking for some significant risk reduction, your TRIR rates for the past couple of years, digging into what kinds of incidents have been occurring, may be a great way for you to figure out what you maybe need to do some risk reduction. Are you having a lot of hand injuries? Are you having a lot of falls from ladders? So that information is valuable in many ways. Just be careful not to say that it means something that it doesn't.
Winding down, I think we've got time for one more.
Okay.
Just ask, what can safety professionals do to normalize the approach to safety metrics that you've discussed here today?
I'll give it a simple answer, and that is for all of us to get on board with the fact that we have a standard that's been developed by a consensus standard approach, to appreciate the work that went into that by the subject matter experts, and to begin to use that as a group and say, this is how we measure occupational safety and health performance. And as we begin to put the wheels under it and give it a little bit momentum and get more and more of us on the bus, so to speak, I think we can begin to change that paradigm in terms of how we measure occupational safety and health performance. So hopefully what's in the standard has you excited enough that you're ready to make a change and you're ready to get started.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, we have run out of time today. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions, but all of today's unanswered questions will be forwarded on to Pam. Once again, we hope you take the time to fill out the forthcoming evaluation survey and give us your feedback. That ends today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. We'd like to thank Pam Woloski, everyone at Avetta, and all of you who listened in. Thanks and have a great day.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.